Hi, welcome to this extension of my Facebook post, my recent Facebook post. The discovery I talked about in that post happened during the month of February. Shirley and I had decided to take the whole month away and go on vacation. And there was two events that happened that led me to this discovery. The first started in Charleston, South Carolina. My nephew Frankie lives there and we decided to visit him. But he was working that day, so we decided to become tourists. So we decided that we would go see this thing called the angel oak tree. It's this live oak tree, this massive thing that's been there forever. And you go to this park and see it. Well, we got to the park and it's closed. You couldn't get in, you couldn't get near it. So we had headed back toward Charleston. Because we weren't really in Charleston, we were in the Sea Islands that kind of run the coast south of Charleston on James Island. And as we're heading back through James Island toward Charleston, we saw a sign pointing to a historical site called the McLeod Plantation. Well, we'd never been to a plantation in our life, but on a whim, we decided to go to a plantation. I don't know what we expected to see. I suppose we expected to see some beautiful manicured antebellum mansion with everyone out in the veranda with mint julep and afternoon teas dressed up like owners and slaves. A complete counterfeit of what it would have been like in real life. But for us and for our great benefit, it turned out that we were going to a plantation that is only one of two in America that is focusing on the historical education of slavery in America. So when you got there, you could go into the mansion and have a look at it if you wanted to. It wasn't part of the tour that they would take you on. The real tour had to do with slavery. It had to do with the people who were enslaved and were there working. And as we toured the grounds, we could see everything that was there. The big, beautiful home one side and these little shacks along the other side. They're about 12 feet wide, maybe 20 feet at the most long, and they were divided in the middle. And one side had kind of a living quarters, and the other side kind of had a cooking quarters and a room, if you wanted to call it that. And so we saw this, and we heard all about the events that happened. See what had happened, this William McLeod, he in 1851, he decided to purchase 17 acres of land there on James Island. And his intention was to grow a thing called Sea Island cotton. And the Sea Island cotton was quite different, very unique to any other cotton. It commanded a very high price point. So he thought he could get rich on it. So to do this, he had to be able to plant the cotton and all this kind of thing. He needed workers. So we went downtown Charleston to a thing called a slave mart. We went and visited that slave mart to see what it was like. And in there, he could purchase slaves. Now, the United States had already banned the importing of slaves into America, but they still bought and sold people on the street and eventually inside buildings in downtown Charleston. So there he bought between 70 and 90 slaves. These slaves built his home. These slaves farmed and grew his cotton. These slaves maintained his property. And by 1860, he was a wealthy man. He was so wealthy that when the Civil War was coming, and it seemed to be a fight between the equality of peoples, he immediately joined the Confederate Army to fight against the North because he wanted to secede from the American dream. He wanted to keep the slavery. Why? Because that's where his money was coming from. So he went off to Virginia. Well, along came the Confederate Army right behind him and took over the property. They kicked out his wife and his children, and they took over the property, leaving some of the slaves to look after the property, become cooks and things of this nature. The rest of them, they told them to leave. I don't know where they could have gone, but they had to leave. And so that's what happened for a few years until near the end of the Civil War, when McLeod wanted to come back to the Charleston area. He was coming back from Virginia, and he contracted pneumonia and died before he got home. His wife and his family, of course, wanted to go back and live on the land, what had happened, Sherman had come through the land and had then ceded ownership of the plantation to the slaves that had worked on there before. And the rule was that you couldn't take back ownership of the land unless the people who were living on the land would allow it. So that went on for a number of years until along came William II, the son of William. And what he did was he went to the courts, and courts were now favorable again, and he obtained title back to the land. So he turned to the people that now owned the land, told them he owned the land, and they could stay if they rented it from him or if they shared in the profits of the crops that were coming from the cotton. Slavery doesn't die very easy, does it? No. Now, generations of the ancestors of those slaves continued to live on that land, paying the rent and sharing in their profits. Then along came a little bug, a little beetle called the boll weevil, and all the cotton crops died off. There was no more money to be made in cotton. So the hard-working African-American people that were living there turned to growing rice. They learned to do rice back in their ancestors' days. And so they started making rice, and they would fish in the waters around them and get shrimp. To this day, shrimp and rice is a common food type you buy in the Charleston area. And generations passed, and many people came and many people went. Many people died. There's a big cemetery there. Names of people that just have come and have gone. But sometime in around the 1930s, the 1940s, a young girl was born there. I think her name was Edna. They told about her history. And what happened was she came into this thing, and people had been leaving, but she was born in one of those shacks, those terrible places that had no running water, had no electricity, had no sanitation, just had a fireplace in it, basically. That was it. And so this young girl, when she became a teenager, she took one of those shacks, and part of it she turned into a place of worship. And people from all living in those shacks all came there. Other people from around the area came there. They listened to her speak, and they were inspired by her. And they turned to God in their situations that they were in. Whatever made that happen? How did this young girl do that? How can she inspire those people? And as I stood there in one of those shacks, and I looked at the place around me, I looked at the walls that had faded painted scriptures. I looked at the fireplace that was now cold and silent, and in the silence as I was sitting there, I couldn't help but ponder, how does someone inspire someone else like she did? Where does the inspiration come from to inspire others? By 1960, everyone had left that plantation. There was no descendants of the African Americans living on that land anymore. In fact, that young girl who was a teenager had been such an inspiration. She had left and become a nurse in northern part of Charleston. And in 1960, after it was let go, the owner of it, who was William II, had one of his children, which is Willie McLeod. He owned the land. He sold it all off except for 37 acres, and that's all that was left at that point. He sold the real estate to make money, and he lived in his house until he died in 1990. He was over 100 years old. And afterwards, the home then was bequeathed, and it became a part of the land that became the historical place that it is today. And so they started looking for people, and they found that Edna living in North Charleston. And they asked her, can you come back? And could you just speak some wisdom into the generations that of today, into what the things were like in the past. She didn't want to come back into that. She didn't even want to see that place where she lived at as a young girl anymore. I kept talking with her. One day she said she'll come back and talk. And as they were preparing for her to come back, the pandemic hit. Edna died in 2021, never to speak. In her grave is the reason for the inspiration that led her to building that place of worship in that little shack. Well, we left there. Days went by and a week went by, and we're now in Florida. We're down in a place called Mount Dora, Florida. What a beautiful place it is. And while we're there, we met a man named Ben and his wife Eve. And Ben and Eve had moved to Mount Dora, but previous to that, they were living in Malta. And in Malta, they had met a man by the name of Doug Gresham. Doug Gresham is a stepson of C.S. Lewis. And he had taught them when they were living in Malta how to become self-sufficient as missionaries. That's what they were doing over there. And what Ben did, he became very skilled at something that everybody wanted. He learned how to brew beer. That's right. And when he came back to Mount Dora, he and his family have purchased a rundown brewery and restaurant in the middle of renovating it. And what Ben says, he's looking forward to the day when he meets every alcoholic from Mount Dora will pass into his doors one day. And they are there, and then he and his wife Eve will get a chance to meet and inspire the alcoholics, the addicts, the homeless, all those people that come there out of love. I think the same kind of love that Edna had for the people back in that plantation in South Carolina. I listened to Ben have a conversation with another man just shortly after that. And Ben was talking about a passage in the Bible. It was a story of the men on the road to Emmaus. Do you remember the story? It was Jesus, he was resurrected, he'd just been crucified recently, and he walks along the road with these two disciples that are heading to this town called Emmaus. And as they're walking, they're talking, and he's talking to them, and he says something to them, which Ben kind of paraphrased to say, "So what's all the fuss about with Jerusalem?" The two men look at him and says, "Who are you? Where have you been hiding out?" I mean, Ben was laughing at it. It was kind of like God who looking down. He must be laughing at this situation. Here's the omnicenter of the universe walking and talking with these two men, and they don't even recognize who he is. And this carried on until they'd stopped, and he had talked to them all the way along, telling them all about the scriptures and how it's fulfilling what the scripture said would have happened that time with the crucifixion. They didn't know who he was. They stopped to eat and they sat down. He takes bread and he breaks it and blesses it. And the two disciples instantly see who he is. And he vanishes from their eyes. And they both look at each other. And they said, "Didn't our hearts burn as we listened to him speak to us?" It was dawning on me that this heart that was burning, that this fire inside was a source of inspiration for Edna back in South Carolina. It was a source of inspiration for Ben and his wife Eve there in Mount Dora, Florida. Ben seemed to say it best when he asked the question, why? Why this burning heart? Why is it in us? Edna had had an encounter. Ben had had an encounter. Both had heard the words of the Creator of heaven and earth. It's been said that the obedience to Jesus makes the many into righteousness. And Jesus said, "I'll take away your heart of stone and I will give you a heart of flesh. Ben said it best. He said, what is this new heart? Jesus, the lover of our soul, said it best in the book of Songs. He said, you have ravished my heart with one gaze from your eyes. The lover of our souls, my friend, is the heart that burns within him. And the heart that he's given to us in place of our heart of stone is his heart. That heart that burns, that heart that burned in those people on that road to Emmaus, the heart that burns in that young girl in South Carolina, the heart that burns in Ben and Eve in Mount Dora, Florida, is the heart of the Creator. He's inspired us. And through that inspiration, we inspire others. I don't think there's anything greater than that. I can't think of anything higher than that inspiration. And so what I discovered is that the goodness of life, the goodness of inspiration emanates from the heart of God. The goodness of life emanates from the heart of God. It doesn't get any better than that, my friends. See you again.